Family is supposed to be the safest place a person can exist. The people who share your name, your blood, your home, they are not the ones you are supposed to fear. A mother gives everything before her children can walk, before they can speak, before they understand what any of it costs her. She is there at the beginning of their lives, building the foundation they will stand on for the rest of their own. Most mothers assume that investment means something. Most mothers are right. For the mothers in this video, the family they built became the last place they ever saw. These 10 cases all share one detail that the headlines tend to skip past. After it was done, after the body was found and the calls were made and the neighbours started talking, the son or the daughter or the husband responsible was still standing there. They made the arrangements. They sat in the front row. They accepted the hugs. They wiped their eyes in public. Some of them spoke at the service. They buried their own act alongside the person they had taken, and then they walked back out into the world and kept going. Today we are covering 10 mothers who were taken by the very family they had spent their lives building. Case 1. Dee Dee Blanchard. Claudine Blanchard, who everyone called Dee Dee, had spent the better part of 2 decades building a reputation as one of the most devoted mothers anyone had ever seen. She pushed her daughter Gypsy Rose everywhere in a wheelchair. She managed a list of medications that filled an entire notebook. She spoke to doctors on Gypsy's behalf, translated her symptoms, kept track of every appointment, every prescription, every specialist referral. She shaved Gypsy's head because Gypsy, she said, was going through chemotherapy. She had a feeding tube fitted into her daughter's stomach. She made sure Gypsy spoke at a child's level and presented to the world as far younger than she actually was. To the people around them in Springfield, Missouri, Dee Dee Blanchard was a saint, and Gypsy Rose Blanchard was a tragedy. A young girl with leukemia, muscular dystrophy, epilepsy, vision problems, hearing problems, a chromosomal condition, and brain damage severe enough, her mother said, to leave her with the mental capacity of a 7-year-old. None of it was real. Not the leukemia, not the muscular dystrophy, not the epilepsy, the hearing loss, the brain damage, or the chromosomal disorder. The wheelchair was not medically necessary. The feeding tube was not medically necessary. The shaved head was not from chemotherapy. Dee Dee shaved it herself. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was, by every honest medical measure, a healthy young woman. Her mother had spent nearly her entire life making sure Gypsy never found that out. The condition Dee Dee is believed to have had is now officially known as factitious disorder imposed on another. Most people still recognize it by its older name, Munchausen syndrome by proxy. It describes a caregiver, almost always a mother, who fabricates or deliberately induces illness in someone else, almost always a child, in order to attract attention, sympathy, and care directed toward herself. The child does not benefit from the illness. The caregiver does. The child is the instrument through which the caregiver gets what they actually want. Dee Dee started this when Gypsy was just a few months old. She told doctors Gypsy had stopped breathing in the night, that she had sleep apnea. As Gypsy got older, the list of supposed conditions grew longer. By the time Gypsy was 8 years old, Dee Dee had added a chromosomal disorder, muscular dystrophy, cancer, epilepsy, and problems with both hearing and vision. She gave Gypsy real medications to make symptoms appear credible. She had a working knowledge of medical language from some nursing training, which made her descriptions precise enough to convince most of the doctors she encountered. And whenever a physician pushed back, whenever someone expressed doubt or asked too many questions, Dee Dee simply moved on to a different doctor. Over 2 decades, she cycled through an extraordinary number of medical providers across multiple states. The procedures Gypsy underwent as a direct result of what Dee Dee told doctors were not minor. She had unnecessary eye operations. She underwent surgery related to the salivary glands. She had the feeding tube inserted into her stomach and used it for years despite being entirely capable of eating solid food. Normally, she was fitted with hearing aids she did not need. She took medications, some of which were used to suppress her immune system, creating real physical symptoms that then required further treatment and gave Dee Dee more documentation to present to the next round of doctors. Each unnecessary intervention produced records and paperwork that then supported the next intervention. The medical file that Dee Dee had constructed around her daughter was, by the time Gypsy was in her late teens, thick enough that no single doctor picking it up fresh could easily see through the accumulation to what was actually underneath. The teeth are the detail that appears in several accounts of the case, and that people who follow it tend to remember. Some of the medications Dee Dee had Gypsy taking over the years had the side effect of damaging dental enamel. Gypsy lost most of her teeth as a result. She had dentures as a teenager and young adult, a consequence not of any illness she had, but of the treatment she had been subjected to for illnesses that did not exist. At least one of those doctors noticed what was actually happening. A pediatric neurologist in Missouri had examined Gypsy and written in her chart that he suspected Munchausen syndrome by proxy. He made note of it. He did not report it to Child Protective Services. He later told journalists that he had not believed he had enough evidence to make that call. He said, after Dee Dee was gone and the truth had come out, that he wished he could have done more. Poor Gypsy, he said. She suffered all those years for no reason at all. He was not the only person who had doubts. Members of Gypsy's extended family were also suspicious at various points. Her cousin later told reporters he had seen Gypsy get up from her wheelchair and push other children around in it. But Dee Dee was charming and tireless, and appeared devastated by her daughter's supposed illnesses in a way that was hard to argue with. And when anyone got too close, Dee Dee moved them both somewhere new. Dee Dee's own background, while not a legal defense for what she did to her daughter, provides context for understanding how a person arrives at the specific kind of deception she constructed. She had grown up in a household where illness and need generated attention and care, and she had absorbed that pattern early. Rod Blanchard, Gypsy's biological father, described Dee Dee to journalists as someone who had started a web of lies she could not find her way back out of. A tornado, he said, that gathered force until no one could stop it. That is probably too gentle a reading of what she did, but it reflects something true about how the behaviour is understood clinically, not as calculated cruelty in the simple sense, but as a compulsion that had locked into place around caregiving as a way of existing in the world. After Hurricane Katrina struck Louisiana in 2005, Dee Dee told people that she and Gypsy had lost absolutely everything. They relocated to Springfield, Missouri. The story of a single mother with a gravely ill daughter who had just survived a catastrophic natural disaster drew instant sympathy from the local community. Habitat for Humanity built them a specially adapted home, fitted to accommodate the wheelchair Gypsy did not actually need. Charities paid for trips. A local organisation arranged for the pair to meet country music artist Miranda Lambert. They went to Disney World. They attended charity events and became minor local celebrities. The brave, sick girl and the selfless mother who had sacrificed everything to care for her. Gypsy grew up, though she was not supposed to. Dee Dee had been falsifying her daughter's age for years by that point. When Gypsy was in her late teens, Dee Dee was still presenting her to the outside world as somewhere around 12 or 13. A younger child attracted more sympathy and fewer questions. But keeping that fiction intact became harder as Gypsy's understanding of the world deepened, as she started asking questions that a young child would not have thought to ask, and as her awareness of her own body grew more difficult to suppress. Gypsy knew she could walk. She had always known. She could eat solid food. She did not have cancer. She had absorbed some of the other diagnoses over the years. Dee Dee had been so consistent, so detailed, and so unwavering for so long that certain things had taken root in Gypsy's mind as facts about herself. But the basic physical reality she understood clearly, even if she had no name for what was being done to her and no framework for understanding why. She tried to leave once when she was a teenager. She walked to a neighbour's house and asked to be taken to a hospital so that doctors could confirm she was not sick. Dee Dee found out, brought her home and, by Gypsy's account, chained her to the bed. Gypsy did not attempt to leave in that way again, The message had been delivered clearly enough. The walls around her were not physical. They were constructed out of documentation. Gypsy had no real identity. Her medical records described a person who did not exist. She had no formal education recognized outside the home. She had no independently verified birth date. The version of her that the world knew was entirely a creation of Dee Dee's making, and dismantling it alone, without any outside help, was effectively impossible. In 2012, Gypsy found access to the internet in a way Dee Dee was not aware of. She created secret online profiles and began making contact with the outside world for the first time in her life. In 2014, through a Christian dating website, she met a man from Wisconsin named Nicholas Godejohn. He was 23 at the time and had been diagnosed with autism. They began exchanging messages, then developed a relationship that became serious over the following months. Gypsy told him the truth about her situation, all of it. Godejohn secretly visited Springfield in early 2015 to meet Gypsy in person. When Dee Dee found out, she told Gypsy she was not to see him again. That restriction did not hold. The two continued communicating and began discussing a way out. Gypsy later told investigators and in interviews that she had seen only one exit available to her. Running away had already proven impossible. Dee Dee had demonstrated that clearly enough years earlier. Gypsy had no money of her own, no legal identity, no practical way to exist in the world without her mother's infrastructure propping her up. She described feeling as though the walls around her were total. In police interview footage that has since become widely viewed, she described how trapped she had felt for as long as she could remember. In June 2015, Godejohn travelled again to the Blanchard home in Springfield. Gypsy waited until Dee Dee had gone to sleep. She then unlocked the door. She gave Godejohn gloves and a knife. She walked to the bathroom, pulled the door shut, and stayed there while he went to Dee Dee's bedroom. Dee Dee Blanchard passed away in her bed that night. She was 48 years old. Gypsy and Godejohn left the house with roughly $4,000 in cash. They took a bus to Wisconsin. Before leaving Springfield, Gypsy posted a message on Dee Dee's Facebook account announcing that Dee Dee was gone. Neighbours and friends who saw the post panicked. They feared Gypsy had been taken, that whoever had harmed Dee Dee had abducted her daughter as well. A welfare check was called in. When investigators arrived at the home, they found Dee Dee, and they found Gypsy's wheelchair still sitting exactly where it always sat, along with her medications, untouched. The assumption was that Gypsy had been carried off without a single thing, which deepened the fear significantly. Police traced the Facebook post to Godejohn's address in Wisconsin and sent officers there. What they found ended the search for a sick, helpless girl. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was standing, walking, unassisted and in full health. She was 23 years old. The person that investigators, charities, doctors, and an entire community had believed to be a frail, wheelchair-bound child was a healthy adult woman in her 20s. Both Gypsy and Godejohn were taken into custody. Godejohn was tried and convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. Gypsy's case was handled with recognition of what had been done to her. Prosecutors took into account the nearly 25 years of sustained abuse she had lived through. She was permitted to plead to a reduced charge and was sentenced to 10 years. The judge, the prosecutors, and her own legal team all acknowledged on record that what Dee Dee had subjected her daughter to represented a severe and prolonged form of child abuse. Gypsy was released in December 2023 after serving just over 7 years. By the time she walked out, the case had already become one of the most discussed true crime stories in recent memory. The subject of an HBO documentary, a Hulu series, multiple books, a Lifetime docuseries, and a 2024 Netflix documentary. Gypsy gave interviews. She appeared relaxed and thoughtful. She spoke openly about what life with Dee Dee had actually been like, and about what freedom felt like after a lifetime of having none. She also became a mother herself in 2025, a fact that carries its own weight given the specific nature of what had been done to her inside what should have been the most protected relationship of her life. The question the case left behind is one that still does not have a clean resolution. Dee Dee passed through dozens of doctors, numerous charity organisations, multiple school systems, and an entire tight-knit community over more than 2 decades. Doubt existed at multiple points along the way. Specific concerns were written into medical charts. None of it resulted in anyone stepping in. Medical child abuse carried out in this form is extraordinarily difficult to detect, precisely because the person responsible appears to be the last person capable of causing harm. They appear devoted. They appear exhausted from the burden of caring for a sick child. They appear to love that child more than anything in the world. That appearance is not incidental to the abuse. It is the mechanism through which the abuse survives. What makes the Blanchard case genuinely hard to categorize is that Dee Dee may well have believed, in her own distorted way, that what she was doing was connected to love. The disorder does not produce people who feel like abusers from the inside. But the harm it produces is real, and the years Gypsy Rose lost are real, and the options she felt she had available to her by the time she was an adult were shaped entirely by a life she had been given no say in building. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That question, of how love and control and harm can exist inside the same relationship, without anyone outside it seeing clearly what is happening, sits at the heart of several of the cases we are going to look at today. But in the next case, there is no ambiguity about the motive, no complicated psychological condition to weigh against the outcome, and no decades of hidden suffering to factor into the picture. There is a Beverly Hills mansion, 2 brothers, 2 shotguns, and a $14 million estate that both of them stood to inherit the moment their parents were out of the picture. Case 2. Kitty Menendez. The Menendez family looked, from the outside, like everything the American dream is supposed to produce. Jose Menendez had arrived in the United States as a teenager from Cuba with virtually nothing. He earned a college scholarship, studied accounting, married a beauty queen named Mary Louise Anderson, who went by Kitty, and spent the following decades climbing to the top of one of the most competitive industries in the country. By the late 1980s, he was a senior executive at a major entertainment company, living in a large mansion in Beverly Hills, California, with a combined family estate worth approximately $14 million. He had helped sign acts including Duran Duran and the Eurythmics to major record deals. He was aggressive, driven, and by most accounts, extremely difficult to work for and to live with. Kitty Menendez had been a beauty pageant competitor and later became the primary figure in the household as Jose's career consumed more and more of his time and attention. The couple had 2 sons. Lyle, the elder, was born in 1968. Eric, the younger, was born in 1970. Both boys attended private schools and were trained in tennis, a sport Jose took extremely seriously as a marker of discipline and achievement. The family was wealthy in a very visible way, and the pressure Jose placed on his sons to be exceptional was significant and, by all accounts, unrelenting. On the evening of August 20th, 1989, Jose and Kitty Menendez were sitting in the den of their Beverly Hills mansion, watching television. It was a Sunday night. The brothers had gone out earlier that evening and purchased 2 shotguns from a store in San Diego using false identification. They came back to the house and entered the den while their parents were seated. What followed lasted only minutes. Both parents were attacked with the firearms at extremely close range. Jose passed away. Immediately. Kitty was struck initially, but not fatally, and in the chaos that followed, additional rounds were fired. By the time the attack stopped, both Jose and Kitty Menendez were gone. Lyle called 911 shortly afterward. On that call, audible to investigators and later played in court, he said, "Someone took the lives of my parents." The initial investigation looked outward. Jose Menendez had, through the nature of his work, accumulated enemies. He had been involved in legal disputes with former business associates. There were reported connections between people he had dealt with professionally and figures operating outside the law. Police followed those threads first because the scene itself and the manner of the attack suggested people who had come to the house with a specific purpose. What pulled attention back to the brothers was not any piece of physical evidence found in those early weeks. It was money. In the days and weeks following their parents' passing, Lyle and Eric Menendez began spending. Lavishly and visibly and very fast. Lyle purchased a Porsche. Eric hired a private tennis coach. There were designer clothes, restaurants, travel, and plans being made for business ventures the brothers were suddenly, very publicly interested in pursuing. For two young men who had just lost both parents, the grief on display in public settings did not match what was being spent and enjoyed behind closed doors. Police also discovered that within days of the incident, the brothers had hired a computer expert to access and delete Jose's most recently updated will. The will had been changed, and its contents were not recovered. The implication investigators drew was plain enough. The brothers had wanted to know what the estate looked like, and had moved quickly to ensure the original, potentially unfavourable version of the document was gone. Eric Menendez was enrolled in therapy at the time, seeing a psychologist named Jerome Oziel. In October 1989, approximately 6 weeks after his parents passed away, Eric told Oziel what had actually happened that night. He confessed. He told his therapist that both he and Lyle had been responsible for what had happened in the den of the Beverly Hills mansion. Oziel recorded portions of these sessions. Oziel had a girlfriend named Judalon Smith. She was aware of the recordings. In March 1990, following a breakdown in her relationship with Oziel, Smith contacted law enforcement and told them what she knew. She told them Oziel had taped Eric's confession and that the recordings confirmed the brothers had taken their parents' lives. Lyle was arrested on March 8, 1990. Eric turned himself in days later. The legal battle that followed became one of the most discussed criminal proceedings of the decade. The first trial began in July 1993 and was televised on Court TV, making it one of the first major American cases to bring courtroom footage into people's living rooms on a sustained basis. Each brother had a separate jury. Both Lyle and Eric took the stand and testified at length, describing in graphic detail what they said had been years of psychological and physical abuse at the hands of their father. Eric testified that the abuse had been ongoing up until shortly before the incident, and that Jose had threatened both brothers with harm if they ever spoke about it. They did not deny that they were responsible for what had happened. Their position was that they had acted in fear, believing their parents were going to eliminate them to prevent the abuse from becoming public. The prosecution's argument was different and more straightforward. Prosecutors said the brothers had taken their parents' lives because they wanted the $14 million estate, wanted their freedom from Jose's relentless control, and wanted to live the way they had already begun to live in the weeks following the attack. Without restriction, without oversight, and with access to money they had not yet earned. Both juries deadlocked. The first trial ended without a verdict. A mistrial was declared. The second trial began in 1995. This time, there was a single jury. The judge in the retrial made a significant ruling that changed the shape of the proceedings. The defense was not permitted to rely on the imperfect self-defense argument in the same way it had been used in the first trial. Additionally, it came out during this retrial that Lyle had asked both a friend and a former girlfriend to provide false testimony in support of the defense. Because of this, Lyle chose not to testify. The jury in the second trial convicted both brothers on all counts in March 1996. First-degree attack on another person, with special circumstances. In July 1996, they were each sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. They had been in custody ever since, until very recently. In May 2023, the brothers' legal team filed a habeas petition seeking to have the original convictions reviewed in light of what they described as new evidence. The most significant piece of that new evidence was a sworn statement from a former member of the boy band Menudo, the group Jose had worked with during his time at the record label. The former band member stated in his declaration that Jose Menendez had assaulted him when he was approximately 14 years old, around the time Jose was managing the group's business affairs. This was presented as corroboration of a pattern the defense had always claimed existed. Separately, a letter Eric had written to a cousin before the incident, a letter in which he made reference to abuse within the family, had also been submitted as part of the petition. In late 2024, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office announced that it was recommending the brothers be resentenced. The recommendation was based not on a determination that the original verdict was wrong, but on the basis of rehabilitation, time served, and evolving legal standards around how abuse histories should be factored into sentencing. The DA's office stated publicly that there was no question the brothers had taken their parents' lives, but that the totality of the circumstances, including the age they were at the time, the psychological trauma they claimed to have experienced, and the 35 years they had spent in custody without further incident, made resentencing appropriate. A judge agreed. Both brothers were resentenced to 50 years to life in prison, which made them immediately eligible to be considered for parole. In the middle of 2025, both Lyle and Eric Menendez appeared before the California Parole Board at separate hearings. Both were denied parole. The board determined that neither man had yet met the full threshold required for release. The case remains open. Further hearings are expected. What the Menendez case permanently altered is not just public understanding of this particular event, but the broader conversation around how abuse histories interact with violent acts committed within families. When the first trial aired on television, public opinion was sharply divided. Significant numbers of viewers watched Eric's testimony and found his account credible. Significant numbers of others believed the financial motive was transparent and the abuse claims were constructed after the fact to provide a legal exit. Those divisions never fully resolved. They simply deepened over the following 3 decades as the culture changed around the case. What was considered implausible by some jurors in 1996, that parents could be capable of the kind of sustained abuse the brothers described, while simultaneously presenting a normal, successful family face to the outside world, is considerably more widely understood now than it was then. Kitty Menendez sits at the center of a specific and painful question in this case that does not get asked often enough. Jose was the primary target of the brothers' stated fear. The claim of abuse was directed almost entirely at him. Eric himself testified that when the moment came, as he entered the den, he simply began firing and did not stop. Kitty was not the person the brothers said they were afraid of. She was not the person they described as the source of the abuse. She was, by their own account, a woman trapped in an unhappy marriage to an extremely domineering man. Yet she passed away that night too. The prosecution pointed to this as evidence that the brothers' stated motivation could not be taken entirely at face value. If the fear was specific and real, and about what Jose was capable of, why did Kitty not survive? The defense offered several responses to this over the course of the proceedings, including testimony about Kitty's awareness of what was allegedly happening and her failure to intervene or protect her sons. But the question of why Kitty died has never been fully answered in a way that satisfies everyone who has followed the case closely. She was 47 years old. She had spent her adult life in the orbit of a man described by nearly everyone who worked with him as relentless and domineering. What she knew, what she chose not to know, and what she was actually capable of doing in the situation she was in are things the trial records can only gesture at. The full picture of who she was and what life in that house had actually been like for her never made it into the courtroom in any meaningful way. The case, from the moment it began, was always really about the 2 brothers and their father. Kitty Menendez became a detail in her own story. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happened in Beverly Hills in August 1989 involved sons who planned what they did, purchased the weapons beforehand, and carried it out in their own home against both of their parents. The next case we are going to look at did not happen in the family home at all. It happened because a young woman in Canada had spent years building an entirely fake life, and the day her parents found out the truth, she decided none of them would survive the consequences. Case 3. Bichhar Pan. Han and Bichhar Pan had come to Canada with almost nothing and built exactly the kind of life they had crossed an ocean hoping for. Both were ethnically Chinese, born in Vietnam, and had immigrated to Canada as part of the large wave of Southeast Asian families who arrived during and after the turbulence of the 1970s and 1980s. They settled in Markham, a suburban city just north of Toronto in Ontario, and over the years established a stable, modest, respectable life there. Han worked. Bichhar worked. They saved carefully. They bought a house in a quiet residential neighbourhood called Unionville. They had 2 children, a son, Felix, and a daughter, Jennifer. Jennifer Pan was, by every outward sign, exactly what her parents had worked so hard to raise. She played piano at a high level from a young age and competed seriously enough that her skill drew real attention. She was academically capable. She dressed neatly, spoke respectfully to adults, and gave no obvious cause for concern. Her parents were strict, as many first-generation immigrant families with deep roots in a culture that values academic achievement tend to be. The expectation in the Pan household was clear and consistent. Education came first, professional success followed, personal life came after, and you did not cut corners or make excuses along the way. Jennifer appeared to understand and accept all of this. She did not. At some point during her teenage years, something in Jennifer's relationship with the life her parents expected of her began to fracture. She was not failing because she lacked intelligence. She was failing because the pressure of maintaining the image of the daughter her parents believed her to be had become something she could not sustain through honest effort alone. The gap between who she actually was and who she presented herself as began to widen. She found a way to manage that gap. She lied. The lying started with smaller things and built slowly into something that eventually consumed almost every area of her life. When her grades in high school were not what her parents expected, she hid it. When she failed to graduate, she did not tell them. She constructed an alternate version of events. She had graduated. She was continuing her education. She was enrolled at university. She was on track. Her parents believed her. The facade was maintained through extraordinary ongoing effort, forged documents where necessary, careful management of what information reached them, and a performance of the diligent, high-achieving daughter that never fully dropped in their presence. For years this held. She had also, by this point, begun a relationship that her parents would not have approved of. His name was Daniel Wong. He worked at a restaurant and was not the kind of person the Pan family's expectations had made room for in Jennifer's future. Jennifer and Wong's relationship was serious. She later described it as the central relationship of her life during those years, the one thing that felt genuinely hers. Her parents found out about it and made their position clear. They did not want her seeing him. In their view, he was not appropriate, and their daughter's future was too important to risk on someone who did not fit the plan they had built their entire immigration story around. Jennifer did not end the relationship. She hid it instead, the same way she had been hiding everything else. This continued until the structure she had constructed could no longer hold its own weight. Her parents began to understand that the education she had described, the degrees she had claimed to be working toward, the career path she had outlined for them, none of it was real. The full scale of what she had fabricated over the years came into focus. The response from Han in particular, in the months that followed this discovery, was to tighten control significantly. He restricted her movement. He reinforced his opposition to Wong. He was, by the account of everyone involved in the subsequent legal proceedings, extremely angry and extremely determined that the situation would change on his terms. By the autumn of 2010, Jennifer Pan had been living this double life for the better part of a decade. She was 24 years old. She had no real qualifications. She was in a relationship her parents actively opposed. She was living in her parents' house in Markham, under a level of scrutiny and restriction that had become almost total. Whatever she had imagined her life looking like by this point bore no resemblance to the reality she was in. She reached out to Wong, and together they began planning. The plan, as it was later established through extensive investigation and court proceedings, was initially focused on Han. Jennifer wanted her father gone. With him gone, she believed the control would lift, the restrictions would end, and she would be free to live as she chose. She had also been promised an inheritance, and with her father removed from the picture, she expected to receive it. She and Wong made contact with an associate named Lenford Crawford, who in turn connected them to others who could carry out what they were arranging. Money changed hands. An arrangement was made. On the evening of November 8, 2010, Bik Ha Pan came home from her weekly line dancing class. This was her routine. She went every Monday. Jennifer knew the schedule. She knew the timing. She had already, earlier that evening, unlocked the front door of the house. Han had gone to bed early, as he typically did. Jennifer had made a phone call. 3 men came through the unlocked front door. They were armed. They moved through the house, found both parents, and brought them downstairs to the basement. Han and Bik Ha were each struck by multiple rounds at close range. Han was severely wounded and lost consciousness. Bik Ha Pan did not survive the night. Jennifer was found upstairs, tied to the banister with a shoelace. She called 911 herself. She told the operator that people had broken into the house. She performed the role of victim with enough surface credibility to be initially treated as one. Paramedics arrived. Han was transported to hospital, where he was placed in intensive care. The first thing investigators noticed was the shoelace. The bindings on Jennifer's wrists had not been applied in a way consistent with being restrained by someone else in the middle of a violent incident. Police noted the inconsistency almost immediately. They also noted that nothing of significant value had been taken from the house. The premise of a home invasion driven by robbery had no supporting evidence beyond Jennifer's account of it. Valuables that an actual robbery crew would have taken were still in place. Then Han woke up. When he regained consciousness and was well enough to speak to investigators, he told them something that redirected the entire case. He recalled that during the attack, he had seen his daughter, not being restrained, not struggling. He had seen Jennifer speaking to one of the men in a way that was quiet and familiar, not the way a person speaks to an armed intruder who has broken into their home. He described her manner toward the man as soft, calm, like someone talking to someone she knew. Jennifer was brought in for further questioning. Canadian law enforcement is legally permitted to use deception during interrogation. Officers can lie about what evidence they have and what they know. They did. Jennifer's account began to shift under questioning. On November 22, 2010, during her third interview, she was arrested. Under questioning, she admitted she had hired people to carry out an attack. But she told investigators the plan had been for them to take her life, not her parents' lives. That she had hired them because she wanted to pass away, not because she wanted them gone. This account did not align with what the evidence showed, and it did not align with what the hitmen themselves told investigators when they were brought in separately. The trial that followed, beginning in 2014, laid out the full architecture of the deception. Years of fabricated education, a secret relationship, a plan coordinated through multiple intermediaries, and a staged crime scene that had been designed to frame what happened as a random act of violence against an innocent family. In December 2014, Jennifer Pan and 3 co-accused, including Wong, were each convicted of first-degree causing of death and the attempted causing of death of Han Pan. Each received a mandatory life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The case did not end there. In 2023, the Ontario Court of Appeal ordered new trials on the first-degree conviction for the loss of Bik Ha Pan. The court found that the original trial judge had made an error. He had only presented the jury with 2 possible explanations for what had happened, when in fact, the evidence supported a third, that the plan had been specifically to eliminate Han, not Bik Ha, and that Bik Ha had been present by circumstance rather than by Jennifer's specific intent toward her. This distinction matters enormously in Canadian law. First degree requires a planned and deliberate decision to take a specific person's life. If the jury had been permitted to consider that Jennifer's plan had targeted only Han, they might have reached a different conclusion about the degree of responsibility for Bik Ha's passing. The Supreme Court of Canada upheld that ruling in April 2025. Jennifer did not face a full retrial. In March 2026, she pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of manslaughter in connection with her mother's passing. She received a life sentence, but became eligible for parole under the terms of that plea, a significant legal distinction from the original sentence. Her father, Han, has had no contact with her since her arrest. Her brother Felix successfully obtained a court order barring her from contacting him as well. The Netflix documentary released in 2024, titled What Jennifer Did, examined the case through the lens of the police investigation and drew enormous viewership. The case has been the subject of a published book and remains one of the most discussed true crime cases in Canadian history. Bik Ha Pan went to her line dancing class on a Monday night and came home to a house where the front door had been left unlocked by her own daughter. She was 55 years old. She had spent her adult life working, saving, and investing everything in a family she believed in. She did not know the person she had raised with that investment. Not really. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That particular horror, building a life for someone who has been running a parallel life you know nothing about, appears in the next case too. But in that one, the mother who tried to stop her daughter's relationship did not come home to an unlocked door. She was asleep in her bed when her daughter's boyfriend came through her front door in the middle of the night with a firearm and a sword. Case 4. Penny Caffey. Alba, Texas is the kind of place where people know each other. It sits roughly halfway between Sulphur Springs and Tyler in East Texas, a rural community of just under 500 people, where the roads are mostly gravel, the land is flat and wooded, and most families have been part of the same social world for generations. Church is central. So is knowing your neighbours, knowing their children, and knowing where everyone stands. The Caffey family was known throughout Alba and the surrounding area, not because they were wealthy or prominent in any formal sense, but because of how they showed up. Terry Caffey was training to be a minister and worked as a home health aide during the week. Penny Caffey, his wife, played piano at Miracle Faith Baptist Church. Their 3 children, 16-year-old Erin, 13-year-old Matthew, and 8-year-old Tyler, were part of the church community in the way that children are when the church is genuinely the centre of family life. The boys played instruments. Erin sang during services, and did so with enough feeling that people remembered it. The Caffeys had moved their children to homeschooling a few years earlier, after an incident at the local junior high school that had concerned them deeply. They wanted their children close, wanted to be involved in what they were learning and who they were around. A Bible verse was carved into a wooden sign that hung above the driveway of their cabin-style home outside Alba. By almost any external measure, they were exactly who they appeared to be, a deeply religious, tightly knit family doing their best to raise their children with clear values in a small town. In the autumn of 2007, Erin Caffey went back to public school. She was 16. She started working part-time as a car hop at the local Sonic drive-in, where she was, by all accounts, genuinely popular with customers. She was petite, had blue-grey eyes, and delivered orders on roller skates, the only car hop at that particular location who did. People who knew her from the Sonic described her as appearing to glow with a kind of innocent energy. Boys came to the drive-in just to be near her. That autumn, through this job, she met Charlie Wilkinson. He was 18 years old. They began spending time together, and the relationship became serious within a few weeks. Wilkinson gave Erin a ring that had belonged to his grandmother and told friends openly that he intended to marry her. Terry and Penny Caffey were not immediately opposed to the relationship. They allowed it initially, or at least tolerated it. But as they watched it develop, they started to pay closer attention to who Wilkinson was. They looked him up online. They found his MySpace page, which contained references to drinking and sexual content that conflicted directly with what the Caffeys stood for as a family. The more they saw, the more concerned they became. By February 2008, Penny and Terry had made their decision. Erin was not to see Wilkinson anymore. The relationship was over. Erin was told to return the ring. The restriction was delivered by two people who genuinely believed they were protecting their daughter. They had no framework for understanding what was already in motion. Friends of Erin's at school later told investigators and journalists that within the same month the restriction was imposed, Erin had started talking openly about wanting her parents gone. Not in the vague, frustrated way teenagers sometimes speak when they feel trapped, but in specific, practical terms. She talked about it as a solution, as a way for her and Wilkinson to be together without interference. This was not the first time she had explored the idea. An ex-boyfriend of Erin's, someone she had dated before Wilkinson, later told investigators that she had previously approached him about harming her family because they had disapproved of their relationship too. He had refused. He had also ended the relationship with her not long after that conversation. Wilkinson has said, and maintained throughout the legal proceedings, that he offered Erin a simpler option, that they could simply run away together, leave Alba, and start somewhere new without any confrontation at all. According to him, Erin refused this. She did not want to run. She wanted her parents gone. Whether Wilkinson is entirely truthful about his own role in the planning is something that cannot be resolved cleanly. What is established through multiple accounts, police interview recordings, and court testimony is that by late February 2008, a plan existed. It involved Wilkinson, a 22-year-old friend of his named Charles Wade, and Wade's girlfriend, Bobby Johnson. Erin knew what was being arranged. She had been part of the conversations that produced it. The night was February 28, 2008, running into the early hours of March 1st. Wilkinson had told Erin one thing before they moved. He would need to ensure that her brothers did not survive what was going to happen. They were old enough to identify him, and he was not willing to leave witnesses behind. Matthew was 13. Tyler was 8. Erin's reported response, captured on police interview recordings played publicly in the aftermath, was, "I don't care. Just do what you got to do." That sentence is the one people who have followed this case remember above everything else, because it is the clearest possible window into what had already happened to Erin Caffey's emotional landscape by the time that night arrived. Whether it represents cruelty, dissociation, or the product of an obsession that had by then overridden everything else in her, the words are what they are. While Erin and Bobby Johnson waited in a car parked outside, Wilkinson and Wade entered the Caffey home. Terry and Penny were asleep in their bedroom. Wilkinson went to their room first, armed with a .22 caliber firearm. The noise from the door woke them. In the seconds that followed, Wilkinson fired. Terry Caffey was struck 5 times. Penny was also struck. When the firearm jammed, Wade produced a sword, a samurai-style blade he had brought with him, and continued the attack on Penny. The injuries she suffered were catastrophic. She did not survive. Wilkinson and Wade then went upstairs to where the boys were. Terry Caffey, lying on the floor of his bedroom with 5 bullet wounds, was still conscious enough to hear what happened next. He heard his son Matthew cry out from upstairs. Matthew's words, as Terry recalled them for investigators and later for journalists, were, "Charlie, Charlie, why are you doing this? No, Charlie, no, please, why are you doing this?" Matthew had recognized the voice. He knew who had come into the house. He was 13 years old, and he was calling out the name of the person he knew. Both boys lost their lives that night. Matthew was struck by the firearm. Tyler, who was 8, was targeted with the blade. The house was then set on fire. Terry Caffey regained consciousness as the flames spread. He had been left for gone. He found a window, got himself through it, and began moving across the ground in the dark away from the burning structure. It took him more than an hour to crawl to the nearest neighbor's house. An hour of moving through the dark on a property in rural Texas with 5 bullet wounds in his body and his family behind him in a burning house. He made it. A neighbor called for emergency services. Terry was taken into surgery and survived. When investigators arrived on the scene in the early hours of March 1st, What they found was a cabin-style home that had been almost entirely consumed by fire. Inside the remains of the structure, the bodies of Penny Caffey, Matthew Caffey, and Tyler Caffey were recovered. Erin had not run. She and Bobby Johnson had driven with Wilkinson and Wade to a mobile home belonging to Wade after leaving the scene. When investigators traced the case back with the speed that serious law enforcement in a small, contained rural community sometimes achieves, all 4 suspects were located and taken into custody within the same day as the attack. Erin was not immediately told what had happened to her father. She was taken in separately. When she was first approached by investigators and family, she was emotional and claimed she had been with Wilkinson against her will, that she had not known what was going to happen, that she had tried to get away. Her grandparents, who came to be with her in the immediate aftermath, believed her. She assured them she had had no part in what had occurred. Then the investigators sat her father down and told him what his daughter's role had been. The recording of Terry Caffey learning this in hospital, wounded, having just survived an attack that took the lives of his wife and both of his sons, has been described by journalists who listened to it as one of the most painful pieces of audio captured in connection with any true crime case they had covered. He asks first how his daughter is. He is told she is fine. He then asks what her involvement was. The officer responds that her involvement was considerable. What followed for Terry Caffey in the months and years after is, by almost any account, extraordinary. He struggled. He considered ending his own life and has spoken publicly about how close that came. He attributes his survival through that period to his faith. He eventually, and without pressure from anyone else, found a way to forgive Erin. He has continued to visit her in prison. He has spoken to journalists and at public events about forgiveness as a practice, rather than a feeling. Something you choose to do, rather than something that arrives on its own. He also intervened in the legal proceedings in a specific and significant way. When prosecutors were pursuing the most severe possible outcome for Wilkinson and Wade, Terry asked them not to. He asked them to take the harshest potential penalty off the table. He cited his faith and said that their removal from the world would not restore anything he had lost. Erin Caffey, 16 years old at the time of the attack, was tried as an adult. In January 2009, she accepted a plea arrangement and received 2 life sentences. She will be eligible to be considered for parole when she reaches 59 years old. Wilkinson and Wade each received life without the possibility of parole. Bobby Johnson, who was present but did not directly participate in the attack, received a 40-year sentence and became eligible for parole after serving 20 years. Erin has given interviews over the years, including one in 2016 with journalist Piers Morgan for a television documentary series. In that interview, she continued to maintain that she had not planned the attack, that she had tried to leave Wilkinson the night it happened, that she had not wanted her family to be harmed. She maintains this position to this day. Her father, the only living member of the family apart from Erin, still believes her version. He says she is his daughter and always will be. What the outside record establishes, through Wilkinson's own statements to investigators, through the testimony of Erin's ex-boyfriend who was approached before Wilkinson, through the accounts of her friends who heard her speaking about wanting her parents gone, and through the police interview recordings, tells a different story than the one Erin tells about herself. Penny Caffey played piano at the church every Sunday. She had a husband who was studying to be a minister, 2 young sons, and a teenage daughter she had tried to protect by drawing a line around a relationship she believed was wrong for her. She was 38 years old. She was asleep in her own house. The sword used in the attack was later recovered. Investigators found it. Wilkinson and Wade had taken it with them after leaving the scene, but had not disposed of it effectively. That detail, small and specific, and almost incidental against everything else in the case, still somehow captures something about the reality of what happened to the Caffey family that night. These were not sophisticated people carrying out a sophisticated plan. They were teenagers and young adults who had talked themselves into something catastrophic and then walked through an unlocked door to do it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case is about another door left open, not literally, but in the relationship between two daughters and a mother who had only just brought them home. Case 5. Nikki Whitehead. Jamaica Whitehead went by Nikki. Almost everyone who knew her called her that. She was 34 years old and living in Conyers, Georgia, a suburban city about 20 miles east of Atlanta in Rockdale County. She worked as a beautician at a salon in Decatur. She had recently enrolled in fashion design classes on top of her salon work, trying to push herself forward. People who worked alongside her described her as open and warm, the kind of person whose presence made a room easier to be in. She was also the mother of twin daughters. Their names were Jasmiyah and Tasmiyah Whitehead, and in January 2010, they had just moved back in with her. That part, the moving back in, matters enormously to understanding what happened next. Nikki had the girls when she was still a teenager herself. Raising them largely fell to her grandmother, Della Frazier, in the early years while Nikki tried to get her own life into a shape that could support 3 people. The twins grew up primarily in Della's household, in an environment their grandmother described as one with few strict rules and a great deal of freedom. Della raised them the way she knew how, and by many accounts she adored them. But the structure a growing household needs, clear expectations, consistent boundaries, accountability, was not the dominant feature of those years. When the girls were around 13, Nikki made a decision. She wanted them with her. She had worked toward that goal, had gotten herself into a more stable position, and she believed she could give them something better than what they had. She fought for custody. She moved the 3 of them to Conyers, into a house in a quiet residential subdivision called Bridal Ridge Walk, and she began the process of being the mother she had not been able to be when they were small. The transition was not smooth. The twins resisted from the start. They had not chosen to leave Della's house. They had not chosen Conyers. The rules Nikki tried to establish around school attendance, phone use, curfews, who they were talking to and when, felt to them like restrictions imposed by someone who had not been there for the years those rules would have been normal, and who was now showing up with authority she had not spent the time to earn in the way they recognized. Conflict started. They escalated. Within a relatively short period of time after the move, police were being called to the Whitehead home. The girls had physically clashed with Nikki on more than one occasion. Court records from the period show that both daughters had made appearances in juvenile court in connection with domestic incidents. Counselling had been ordered. Nothing resolved the underlying tension. Things got bad enough that the twins were temporarily removed from Nikki's home. They went back to their great-grandmother's house while the situation was assessed. From Nikki's side, she had been doing what any parent in her position would, calling for help when the behaviour exceeded what she could manage alone. From the twins' side, they had never wanted to be there. In early January 2010, a court ordered the twins to return to Nikki's home. They had been away. Now they were going back. Nikki had called police 3 times in the week between the court order and what happened on January 13th. 3 times in 7 days. The exact nature of each call is part of the record. There was an incident involving food being thrown. There was a confrontation involving an aunt at a gathering that turned physical, and there was at least 1 additional call. By the standards of any domestic situation, this was a household in genuine crisis. The twins did not want to be there. Nikki was trying to hold a line she had very little practical support in holding. On the afternoon of January 13th, 2010, a Rockdale County Sheriff's Office deputy happened to be driving through the Bridal Ridge Walk neighborhood. One of the twins ran toward his vehicle from the direction of the house and flagged him down frantically. The deputy stopped. The girl told him her mother was gone, that something had happened, that he needed to come inside. The deputy entered the house. He found Nikki Whitehead in the bathtub in the master bathroom. Lieutenant Chris Moon of the Conyers Police Department was one of the officers who arrived on scene in the immediate aftermath. He described what he found inside that house as the most heavily attended crime scene he had encountered in his career to that point. The level of harm done to Nikki Whitehead was extreme. She had sustained wounds across her body. investigators would later count in excess of 80 separate points of injury. Deep wounds had penetrated both of her lungs. The jugular vein had been struck. Her spinal cord had been damaged to the degree that it was nearly severed. The medical examiner who reviewed the evidence made two findings that shaped the entire investigation. First, that every significant wound Nikki had sustained was technically survivable, meaning that if she had received immediate medical treatment, she would have lived. Second, that this was a crime of passion, not the work of a stranger, not a planned intrusion from outside. The nature of the attack, the volume of wounds, the closeness of the contact, the location within the home, was consistent with someone known to the victim. The twins were separated and treated as potential witnesses and victims in those first hours. They were visibly distressed. Officers noted their emotional state and, at first, extended them the assumption that they were who they appeared to be. Two teenagers who had come home and discovered something horrific. But details began to accumulate that did not fit. Nikki's boyfriend at the time was an obvious early focus. He was looked at carefully. DNA testing cleared him completely. What the DNA testing also did was establish that biological material found at the scene matched the twins. A forensic dentist was brought in to examine something that investigators had noticed during their initial contact with one of the girls. Tasmiyah had a bite mark on her left arm. When the dentist compared the pattern of that bite mark against dental impressions taken from both the twins and from Nikki's body, the conclusion was clear. To a reasonable degree of scientific probability, the bite on Tasmiyah's arm had been made by her mother. Nikki had bitten her daughter during the fight. Surveillance footage from a nearby business also complicated the timeline the girls had given. They had told investigators they had gone to school the morning of January 13th and come home to find the scene. The footage showed them walking away from the house, reaching a gas station some distance away, and then accepting a lift from a passing driver. They arrived at school approximately 2 hours later than their story required. There was a gap in the morning that the footage made visible. A letter was found. Tasmiyah had written to her boyfriend at some point before January 13th, expressing in direct terms how much she resented being in her mother's home, how much she wanted the situation to be different. Investigators found this in the process of building the case. It was one more thread that pulled the picture into a shape the twins' own account could not explain. They were charged in May 2010, 4 months after Nikki passed away. At the time of charging, both were 20 years old. They were held in separate county facilities. Both pleaded not guilty. For several years, the legal process ground forward. Then, in January 2014, Tasmiyah entered a guilty plea. She stood before Rockdale County Chief Superior Court Judge David Irwin and admitted her role. The judge, in his remarks during sentencing, called what had happened a tragedy of epic proportions. Tasmiyah was sentenced to 30 years in prison. 1 month later, Jasmiyah entered the same plea. She received the same sentence. Both women were incarcerated in separate facilities within the Georgia Department of Corrections. Tasmiyah at Arundel State Prison, Jasmiyah at Pulaski State Prison. What their confessions described, when investigators later made portions of them publicly available through an open records process, was a morning that had started with something mundane and ended somewhere nobody should have been able to reach from that starting point. The twins had woken up late. They were going to be late for school. Nikki confronted them about it. The argument that followed escalated. Nikki, according to the account Tasmiyah gave, picked up a pot from the stove and moved toward the girls with it. Jasmiyah, in her own account, described the situation developing until Nikki had a knife and the struggle over it became physical. Jasmiyah described the moment directly in her recorded confession. She said her mother was getting the better of the situation, that Nikki was, in her words, winning the fight. She said she picked up the pot and used it on her mother. Then Tasmiyah became involved, and Nikki was struck with the blade. At some point during what followed, Nikki managed to get out of the house. The evidence and the confession align on this. She went to a neighbour's house. She was looking for help. Then she came back. The reasons she came back, or whether she was brought back, are not entirely clear from the publicly available record. What is clear is that after she returned, the attack continued inside the house. The twins dragged Nikki to the bathtub. They left her there. They then left the house, walked towards school, and did not call for help during the hours that followed. The medical examiner's finding that the wounds were survivable if treated promptly sits alongside the detail of Nikki going to her neighbour's house in a way that is genuinely difficult to process. She found a way out of the house in the middle of what was happening to her. She reached another person's door. Whether she received help there, whether anyone understood the severity of what she was experiencing, what was said, these details have not been fully confirmed in the public record. What is confirmed is that she went back to the house on Bridal Ridge Walk, and she did not come back out. The grandmother, Della Frazier, was asked about her granddaughters in the aftermath of all of this. She said she had always imagined them at Harvard or Yale, that she had never, in her most worried moments about them, imagined them sitting in a prison cell. She described losing both her granddaughter and Nikki at the same time, one to what had happened, and two others to the consequences of it. Nikki Whitehead had fought for custody, had gone to court, had kept calling police that week when things escalated because she was trying to manage a situation that was genuinely beyond her. She had been trying, in her own way and with the tools available to her, to be the mother she wanted to be. The system had sent the twins back to her. A week later, she was gone. Jasmia's final memory of her mother, as she described it in her confession, was of Nikki's voice in those last moments, saying that she hated them, that they were going to go to prison. Then, in Jasmia's words, her mother went under in the water a couple of times. And that was it. Jasmia also said, in the same confession, that she was sorry, that she missed her mother, that it was not the way people were trying to make it seem, that she had not hated her, that it had been the heat of the moment and the anger between all three of them. What to do with that, with the grief and the admission and the act itself all existing in the same person at the same time, is one of the questions this case leaves permanently open. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case we are going to look at is the oldest one in this video. It took place in 1954 in New Zealand, and the two people responsible for it were not fighting with their mother over school or curfews or a pot on a stove. They had built an entire fantasy world together, one so consuming, so private, and so real to them that when someone threatened to separate them, they decided that person had to be removed from the world entirely. Case 6. Honora Parker. Christchurch, New Zealand in the early 1950s was a particular kind of place. It had been built by British settlers who brought with them a set of social expectations about how life should be arranged, how children should behave, what families should look like, what was proper and what was not. It was a city of churches, of established institutions, of people who knew their position in a recognisable social order and, for the most part, stayed in it. The girls at Christchurch Girls' High School moved through a world with clearly drawn lines. Pauline Yvonne Parker and Juliet Marion Hume met at that school in 1952. Pauline was 14, Juliet was 13. Both had spent significant stretches of their childhood in and out of school due to health problems. Pauline had osteomyelitis, a serious bone infection that had affected her leg and kept her out of formal education for extended periods. And Juliet had been sent away to various locations overseas during her early years because of tuberculosis, spending time in the Bahamas and in South Africa while her lungs recovered. Neither girl had grown up with a conventional, unbroken experience of school and the social world that surrounds it. When they found each other, something locked into place between them that neither had experienced before. Juliet came from a more prominent family than Pauline. Her father, Henry Hume, was the rector of Canterbury University College, a position of genuine academic standing in a city that took those distinctions seriously. Her mother, Hilda, was outgoing and socially active in a way that attracted attention. The Hume household had a different texture to it than what Pauline had grown up in. Pauline's family was working class. Her mother, Honora Parker, ran a boarding house to bring in income. The two girls came from different ends of Christchurch's social geography. That gap did not separate them. If anything, it was part of what drew them together. What they shared was more fundamental than background. They were both highly imaginative. Both had been isolated by illness during critical years. Both had a kind of interior life that the ordinary social world of school had never really made space for. They began spending enormous amounts of time together. The friendship deepened at a pace and to a depth that went well beyond what either set of parents had seen in their children's previous relationships. They created a world of their own. They called it the Fourth World, a private, entirely self-constructed universe with its own geography, its own history, its own population of figures they had invented and whom they treated with the seriousness of real people. The saints of the Fourth World, as they called them, were drawn partly from actors and celebrities the girls admired, and partly from original creations of their own. They performed rituals in connection with these figures. They wrote extensively about the world they had built together, and Pauline in particular kept detailed diaries that recorded both the development of their shared fantasy and the texture of her inner life with a degree of honesty and precision that is almost impossible to read, in retrospect, without recognizing what was building. The relationship between them has been analysed at enormous length over the 7 decades since 1954. Whether it was romantic, whether it met the clinical definition of shared psychosis, folie à deux, which describes a delusional belief system developing jointly between two people in close contact, or whether it was something harder to categorise, remains genuinely contested among the people who have studied it. What is not contested is what the relationship did to the boundaries both girls had with the outside world. The Fourth World was more vivid to them than Christchurch. The figures they had created were more real than the social world they were expected to inhabit. And anyone who tried to interfere with their time together was, in the logic of the world they had built, someone acting against something sacred. Honora Parker had concerns about the friendship from early on. She raised them. Pauline's diary records arguments with her mother about how much time she was spending with Juliet, about the nature of the relationship, about whether it was healthy. The parents on both sides tried at various points to introduce separation, brief periods where the girls were kept apart in the hope that distance would recalibrate things. The opposite happened each time. Separation made the bond more intense, not less, and the periods apart produced in Pauline a kind of desperation that she recorded in her diary with total clarity. The crisis that produced what happened in June 1954 came from outside the girls' control entirely. Henry Hume had decided to leave New Zealand. His marriage to Hilda had been in serious difficulty. Hilda had been involved in a relationship with another man, a lodger named Walter Perry, who had been living in the Hume household. Henry and Hilda were separating. Henry was leaving his position at the university and returning to England. In the context of this family breakdown, a decision was made about Juliet. She was not going to remain in Christchurch. She was to be sent away, to South Africa, to stay with acquaintances there, away from the dissolving family situation and away from Christchurch, away from Pauline. Pauline asked her mother to allow her to go with Juliet. Honora said no. The reasons were practical and financial. The Parkers did not have that kind of money, and Honora also believed clearly that separation was the right thing for her daughter, that the friendship had become something unhealthy and that distance was the appropriate response to it. From that point on, the logic of what followed belongs to what Pauline and Juliet had built together, rather than to any recognizable external reasoning. Pauline's diary, which became the central piece of evidence in the trial that followed, and which has since been quoted extensively by journalists, academics, and filmmakers, shows the shift happening in real time. She wrote about how she and Juliet had discussed things together and arrived at what she called a plan. She described the day they had selected for carrying it out, referring to it in her diary entries in the weeks before June 22nd, 1954, as the happy event. She wrote about it with an eagerness that is one of the most chilling things in the historical record of this case. Not because it is the language of someone disconnected from reality in an obvious way, but because it is clear and purposeful and entirely her own. June 22nd, 1954, was a Tuesday. Pauline arranged for her mother to join her and Juliet on a walk through Victoria Park, a green space in the hills of Christchurch. The plan was framed as a pleasant outing: tea at the park's tea rooms beforehand, then a walk along one of the park's paths through trees and hills. Honora Parker went along with no reason to expect anything other than what she had been told. The three of them had tea at the Victoria Park tea rooms. Witnesses later confirmed they had been there and that nothing about their behaviour appeared alarming. After tea, they walked together out onto one of the park's secluded paths, away from the public areas. Pauline and Juliet had brought a half brick with them. They had placed it inside a stocking, which allowed them to hold it and swing it. On the path, one of the girls, the exact sequence was established in evidence but has been described slightly differently in various accounts over the years, dropped something, causing Honora to bend down. What followed happened on a secluded section of the path, away from sight. Honora Parker was struck more than 40 times. The forensic evidence presented at trial confirmed the severity of what she had sustained. She passed away on that path in Victoria Park on the afternoon of June 22nd, 1954. She was 45 years old. A passerby who encountered the girls in the aftermath of the attack on the path found them in a state of considerable distress. They said Honora had fallen and hit her head, that she had slipped. The person who found them helped them get Honora to the tea rooms, where the staff and other visitors immediately understood from the severity of what they were seeing that this was not an injury from a fall. An ambulance was called. The investigation that followed was rapid. Pauline's diary was found at the Parker home within the first 24 hours. Whatever chance the girls might have had of constructing a workable alternative account of what had happened on that path ended the moment investigators read it. The entries leading up to June 22nd described the planning directly. The entry for June 22nd itself was brief. It confirmed that what they had planned had been done. Both girls were arrested. They were tried together for the taking of Honora Parker's life. The trial was conducted in Christchurch in August 1954 and attracted enormous press attention in New Zealand and internationally. The defence attempted to argue that both girls were suffering from a shared mental illness severe enough to meet the legal threshold for a finding that they were not criminally responsible. The medical witnesses called by both the defence and the prosecution disagreed substantially with each other about the nature and severity of what afflicted them. The jury was not persuaded by the defence's argument. Both Pauline Parker and Juliet Hume were found guilty. Because they were both minors at the time of the act, Pauline was 16, Juliet was 15. They could not be sentenced in the way an adult would have been. Under New Zealand law at the time, they were ordered to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, a term meaning they would be held until authorities determined they were no longer a risk. They were separated immediately upon conviction and held in different facilities. They served approximately 5 years each. Both were released in 1959. The conditions of their release included a stipulation that they were never to make contact with each other again. They complied with that condition, as far as the publicly available record shows. They also both built entirely new identities. Juliet Hume changed her name and eventually settled in England. In the decades that followed, she became a crime novelist, a successful and prolific one, writing under the name Anne Perry. Her Thomas Pitt series and her William Monk series together sold millions of copies across dozens of countries. She became a respected and recognised figure in the crime fiction world, winning awards and attending literary events and giving interviews about her craft. Nobody in that world knew who she was. Her identity was uncovered and publicly revealed in 1994 when Peter Jackson released his film Heavenly Creatures, which dramatised the case and the relationship between the two girls. The film starred Kate Winslet as Juliet and Melanie Lynskey as Pauline. It was received as a significant work of cinema and brought enormous renewed attention to the 1954 case. Journalists who were researching the background of the film identified Anne Perry as Juliet Hume. The revelation was reported globally. Perry confirmed it, acknowledged what had happened in 1954, and expressed that she carried the weight of it. She continued writing and publishing until her passing in 2023. She was 84 years old. Pauline Parker also changed her name and built a life in private. Various accounts over the years have placed her in England, living quietly. She has never spoken publicly about what happened. Her current circumstances are not a matter of public record, and no credible confirmed account of her life after 1959 has been published. Honora Parker left behind Pauline's father, Herbert Reaper, and the boarding house on Gloucester Street. She had been trying to protect her daughter from something she could see was consuming the girl's ability to live in the real world. In the logic of 1954 Christchurch, a mother with concerns about her teenage daughter's intense and unsettling friendship, who tried to separate them and impose limits, was doing exactly what she was supposed to do. She was acting sensibly. She was trying to be responsible. What she did not know, what she could not have had any reasonable way of knowing, was that in the private world her daughter and Juliet had built together, the plan was already written down, that the tea and the walk she had been invited on had a purpose entirely different from what it appeared to be. The Parker-Hume case occupies a particular position in the history of these kinds of cases because of how young the people involved were, because of how extensively documented their inner world turned out to be through Pauline's diary, and because of what both of their lives became afterward. One became a celebrated novelist. One disappeared entirely. Honora Parker, who was on that path with them, does not have a second chapter. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case involves a man who had a second chapter lasting almost 20 years, who left the scene of what he had done, built a new life, remarried, and came within a phone call of never being found at all. Case 7. Helen List. The house at 431 Hillside Avenue in Westfield, New Jersey, was far too large for what the List family could actually afford. It had 19 rooms. It had been built in the Victorian era and sat on a substantial property that required ongoing maintenance. There was a ballroom on the ground floor, an actual ballroom, left over from a time when the house had belonged to someone with the means to use it. The mansion, as the neighbours called it, was the kind of property that communicated a very particular kind of success. John Emil List had purchased it in 1965 and moved his family in, and in doing so had made a statement about who he was and where he stood. The statement was not true. John List was an accountant. He was meticulous, controlled, and deeply religious in the formal, observant way of someone for whom faith was both genuine and also a framework for maintaining a specific self-image. He attended church consistently. He was a member of his local Lutheran congregation and was regarded there as a serious, committed man of faith. In his professional life, he presented the same face: organised, precise, reliable. Beneath that surface, the finances of the List household had been collapsing for years. John had lost a senior banking position in 1965, around the time the family moved into the Hillside Avenue mansion. He spent the following years working in a series of positions that paid less than what the house and the family's lifestyle required. He borrowed money to cover the gaps. He cashed in life insurance policies. He used funds that had belonged to his mother, Alma, who lived in a third-floor apartment in the mansion, and whose savings he had access to. He kept none of this from his family in the sense of telling them directly. He kept it from them by performing, every single morning, the routine of a man who had his affairs in order. He dressed for work. He left the house at the correct time. On days when he had no office to go to, he went to the train station in Westfield and sat reading newspapers until the appropriate hour to return home. This had been going on for some time by the autumn of 1971. His wife Helen was in poor health. The specific illness she was dealing with had been progressing and affected her capacity to manage the household in the way she previously had. His daughter Patricia was a teenager who had become involved in local theatre and who had, in her father's estimation, been drifting from the kind of religious seriousness he believed the family should maintain. His two sons, Frederick and John Jr., were younger, both still at the ages where the world was mostly school and the immediate neighbourhood. Alma List, his mother, was 84 years old and living in the apartment on the third floor, largely separate from the daily life of the floors below. John List made his plan carefully and over time. He cancelled the family's subscriptions to the newspaper and the milk delivery. He wrote to the children's schools and to places where the children had part-time work, explaining that the family would be away for an extended period, visiting a sick relative in North Carolina. He arranged for the mail to continue arriving. Stopping it abruptly would attract attention. He settled on a date. November 9th, 1971 was a Tuesday. What John List did that day in the house on Hillside Avenue has been reconstructed through the investigation that followed and through his own eventual admissions. He moved through the house systematically. Helen was taken in the kitchen. His daughter Patricia was taken elsewhere in the house. His sons, Frederick and John Jr., were reached when they came home from school during the course of the day. Alma, in her third-floor apartment, was also taken. All 5 members of his family lost their lives that day. Helen was 36 years old. Alma was 84. Patricia was approximately 16. Frederick was approximately 13. John Jr. was approximately 11. After it was done, John List did something that still strikes anyone who studies the case as one of the most revealing details in its entire history. He arranged the bodies of Helen, Patricia, Frederick and John Jr. in the ballroom on the ground floor. He placed each of them on a sleeping bag. He laid them out with a kind of deliberate orderliness. His mother, Alma, he left in her apartment on the 3rd floor. The official explanation later offered was that she was too heavy to carry down. He then went through the house and removed every photograph that contained his own image. He went to his study and sat down and wrote a letter to his pastor, Reverend Eugene Raywinkle, at Redeemer Lutheran Church. The letter ran to 5 pages. In it, he explained what he had done and why. He stated that he had seen too much corruption in the world, that his family members were straying from their faith, and that by ending their lives, he was ensuring their souls would go to a better place than what the world had in store for them. He expressed no indication that he believed himself to be doing anything other than the most difficult and painful version of the right thing. He left the letter on the desk in his study. He turned several lights on throughout the house, enough that the building would appear occupied from the outside. He tuned a radio to a religious station and left it playing. He adjusted the thermostat downward, lowering the temperature in the house significantly. He then walked out the front door of 431 Hillside Avenue and did not look back. He drove to Kennedy Airport and boarded a flight. By the end of that day, John List was gone. The bodies of his family were not discovered for 27 days. The combination of things he had done before leaving, the notes to schools, the cancelled deliveries explained in advance, the illuminated windows, created enough of an impression of a normally functioning household that none of the neighbours moved to investigate until the lights in the upper floors began to go out one by one as bulbs burned through with nobody to replace them. When the pattern became impossible to ignore, neighbours called police. Officers entered the house through a basement window they found unlocked. They found Helen and the children in the ballroom. They found Alma on the 3rd floor. They found the letter on the desk in the study. They found a house in which almost every family photograph had been carefully stripped of the one face investigators needed to identify. Westfield, New Jersey, was a community that had recorded very few violent incidents in the years leading up to that November. The discovery at 431 Hillside Avenue generated immediate national attention. A full investigation was launched. The letter to the pastor confirmed who was responsible. What it did not do was tell investigators where John List had gone. And in 1971, without the digital infrastructure that would later make disappearing considerably harder, a determined and methodical man could build a new life with very little to stop him. John List had taken a new name. He became Robert Peter Clark. He eventually settled in Virginia, where he found work in accounting, the only profession he had ever genuinely known. He joined a Lutheran church. He was, by all accounts of the people who knew him in those years, a quiet and unremarkable neighbour. He remarried. His new wife, a woman named Dolores Miller, had no knowledge of who he actually was or what he had left behind in New Jersey. He lived this way for 17 years and 8 months. In May 1989, the television programme America's Most Wanted broadcast a segment dedicated to the case of John Emil List. The show had launched the previous year and had already demonstrated that its format, detailed reconstructions of unsolved cases broadcast to a national audience, could produce results that conventional investigative methods had not. For the List segment, producers had worked with a forensic sculptor named Frank Bender, who had been given the task of determining what John List might look like in 1989 rather than 1971. Bender's approach was not simply to age the face photographically. He worked with a psychiatrist named Richard Walter to develop a profile of how List's specific personality type, the rigid, controlled, image-conscious man the letter and the crime scene described, would have aged. They factored in posture, likely weight changes, the way a person of that type carries themselves as they get older. Bender produced a three-dimensional bust of what they believed John List looked like at the age of 63. The bust was displayed during the America's Most Wanted broadcast. The segment included details of the case and a description of List's known habits and characteristics. Within days of the broadcast, a woman in Colorado contacted the program. She had known a man named Robert Clark in Denver some years earlier, before he had moved to Virginia. She had watched the segment and looked at the bust. She was certain she recognized him. She provided the investigators working with the show enough information to pursue the lead in the direction of Virginia. On June 1st, 1989, less than 2 weeks after the broadcast, John List was located at his workplace, an accounting firm in Richmond, Virginia, called Madrea, Joyner, Kirkham and Woody. Officers took him into custody there. He maintained his assumed identity for some time after arrest. The confirmation of who he actually was came through a fingerprint match against his military service records. He eventually admitted his real identity in February 1990, confronted with evidence he could not dispute. He was extradited to New Jersey. The trial was conducted in 1990. John List entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, arguing that his state of mind at the time of the act had been so distorted by religious conviction and financial despair that he could not be held criminally responsible in the conventional sense. The jury did not accept this. In April 1990, he was convicted on 5 counts of first-degree taking of life, one for each member of his family he had attacked that Tuesday in November 1971. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms. Under New Jersey law, that meant he was not eligible for parole for the better part of a century. He died in prison on March 21, 2008. He was 82 years old. He had served 18 years in custody. The pastor he had addressed the letter to, Reverend Raywinkle, had died before the case was ever resolved. The letter sat in the evidence record of a case that had no active suspect for the better part of 2 decades. When John List was finally identified and the full shape of what he had done became publicly understood, the 5-page document he had left on his desk took on a significance beyond the case itself, as a portrait of what a particular kind of self-deception looks like when it reaches its logical end. A man who had spent years maintaining an image he could not back up with reality had eventually reached a point where the only way he could see to protect that image was to ensure that the people who had depended on him were no longer present to observe the failure. Helen List was 36 years old. She had been dealing with serious illness in a household where the man she depended on for stability had been pretending every single morning that stability existed. What her life in that house had actually been, what she knew or sensed or understood about the real financial situation, is not something the record fully captures. She appears in this case primarily through what was done to her, rather than through her own account of who she was, because she did not survive to give one. Alma List was 84. She had raised a son who had, with extraordinary patience and care, dismantled every safety net available to him, and then looked at the people around him and concluded that they were the problem. The money he had used to fund his increasingly hollow performance of success had included hers. The house at 431 Hillside Avenue was eventually demolished. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case also involves a mother whose teenage daughter decided she was the obstacle standing between her and the life she wanted. But in California in 2009, the plan was not constructed over months by a methodical man trying to protect a crumbling image. It was built through late-night messages between two people who had met online and who convinced each other, in the specific way that closed and private communication between two isolated people sometimes does, that there was only one way forward. Case 8. Joanne Witt. El Dorado Hills is an unincorporated community in El Dorado County, California, sitting in the foothills east of Sacramento, where the landscape opens up into wider residential streets, planned subdivisions, and the kind of quiet suburban order that people tend to move toward when they want distance from city density. Joanne Witt lived there with her teenage daughter Tyler, in a house that, from the outside, contained nothing remarkable. She was 47 years old, worked as an engineer for El Dorado County, and by the account of her family, was devoted to her daughter in the complicated way that single mothers, who are also the sole financial provider for a household, often are, simultaneously the only adult in the room and the person responsible for everything that happens in it. The relationship between Joanne and Tyler had not been simple for years. Court records indicate Joanne had briefly lost custody when Tyler was very young, following a physical incident. As Tyler entered her teens, the tension between them had not disappeared. It had changed shape, taken on the particular friction of a mother trying to maintain authority over a daughter who had already started looking for a way to exist beyond it. In December 2008, Tyler was 14 years old and in her first year of high school. She had started spending time at a local coffee shop in El Dorado Hills. It was the kind of place teenagers go when they want to be somewhere that is not school and not home. At that coffee shop, she met Stephen Paul Culver. He was 19 and went by the nickname Boston. They began spending time together as friends first, and then, according to Tyler's own later account, they started an intimate relationship on February 23, 2009. She would remember the exact date. Culver was 5 years older than Tyler. The age gap and Tyler's age made the relationship not just something Joanne would disapprove of, it made it something with specific legal consequences for Culver if it became known. Tyler wanted Culver close. She had a solution to the problem of where he was living. She suggested he rent the spare bedroom in her mother's house. To make this work, she told Joanne that Culver was her friend, a platonic one, harmless in the specific way she needed her mother to believe he was. Joanne agreed to rent him the room. Culver moved in. The arrangement gave Tyler and Culver daily access to each other under her mother's own roof, with Joanne believing she was simply helping her daughter's friend with a place to stay. This held for about a month. One evening, Joanne came home and went to Culver's room. What she found ended the fiction entirely. Tyler was inside the room, unclothed, and clearly not there as a friend. The reality of what had been happening under her roof became unavoidable in a single moment. Joanne moved immediately. She called a friend named Vinny Catapano to come to the house and physically assist in removing Culver. Catapano came. Culver's belongings were moved to the sidewalk. He was warned directly, and in terms that left no room for ambiguity, that he was not to have further contact with the Witt family. Joanne considered at that point filing a formal complaint about the relationship given Tyler's age. Tyler promised the relationship was over. On the basis of that promise, Joanne agreed not to pursue it immediately. The relationship was not over. Culver and Tyler continued seeing each other in the time Joanne spent at work or asleep, arranging meetings in the gaps of a household routine they both now understood in detail. Joanne discovered this. The precise moment is not part of the public record, but what is established is that by the spring of 2009, she had found enough evidence that the relationship had continued that she went to the El Dorado County Sheriff's Department and filed a formal complaint regarding Culver's relationship with her underage daughter. Culver, now facing the prospect of a serious legal process, was terrified. He was 19 years old, and the complaint meant investigators would be looking at him. Tyler had kept a journal, and Joanne had found it and handed it over as part of what she provided to investigators. The journal contained enough detail about the relationship to make the legal situation extremely serious for Culver. When Tyler found out her journal had been handed over, she understood what it meant for Culver. She told him. The two of them discussed what they were facing, and according to the account established through the subsequent investigation and trial, arrived at a plan that drew heavily from a story they had both apparently connected with, the story of Romeo and Juliet. They were, in the telling they constructed for themselves, and for at least one friend, two people whose love was being destroyed by forces outside their control. They would go to San Francisco together. They would take their own lives there. They would be together in the only way that the world was apparently going to allow. There was one problem with this plan as they constructed it: Joanne. If they left, and Joanne was still present and functional, and had already filed a complaint, the legal process would continue, regardless of where they went. They decided she could not be left behind in that state. On the night of June 11, 2009, Tyler prepared her mother a drink and added a significant quantity of sleeping medication to it. Joanne drank it and lost consciousness. Once she was asleep, Tyler contacted Culver. He came to the house. He had brought a large chef's knife with him, one he had taken from the restaurant where he was working at the time. Joanne Witt was attacked in her bed. She sustained 20 stab wounds. The wounds were concentrated on the upper half of her body, her face, neck, and arms. She did not survive. After it was done, Tyler and Culver turned the air conditioning in the house down to a lower temperature than normal. The purpose, as investigators later determined, was to slow down the physical changes that would make the time of passing easier to establish. They wanted a larger window before anyone would understand what had happened. They then went to visit a friend. His name was Matthew Widman. They arrived at Widman's home and told him directly what they had just come from doing. Culver showed him a white shopping bag. Inside it was a butcher knife covered in blood. This visit, the choice to go to someone they knew immediately after and tell him, to show him the knife, is one of the details in this case that investigators and journalists have returned to repeatedly, because it sits so far outside what any rational calculation of self-preservation would produce that it says something significant about the state the two of them were in that night. They left Widman's and drove towards San Francisco. Joanne did not appear at work the following day, June 12th. Her supervisor noted her absence and tried to reach her. When she also failed to appear the day after that, he contacted both the El Dorado County Sheriff's Department and Joanne's parents, Norb and Judy Witt. Joanne's parents drove to the house. Law enforcement was already on the scene when they arrived. Norb Witt unlocked the front door. Officers entered. They found Joanne in her bedroom. She had been there for several days. The air conditioning had been set low. The 20 stab wounds on her face, neck, and arms were recorded in the forensic examination that followed. The sleeping medication in her system was identified. The lowered temperature and the timeline of her absence together allowed investigators to establish with reasonable precision when she had passed and under what circumstances. Attention moved immediately to Tyler and Culver. Both were absent. Their phones and communications were examined. A manhunt was initiated. On June 16, 2009, 5 days after the night of June 11th, officers located Tyler and Culver at a shopping center in San Bruno, California, south of San Francisco. They had not completed the plan they had described to Widman. They had been found before reaching whatever endpoint they had in mind. Both were taken into custody. In custody, they blamed each other. Each account placed the primary responsibility for what happened to Joanne on the other person. Culver told investigators and later testified in court that when he arrived at the Witt home on the night of June 11th, Joanne was already gone, that Tyler had already acted, that he found Tyler holding a knife when he got there. The prosecution's position was that the physical evidence did not support this account and that Culver had wielded the knife. While held, both Tyler and Culver also attempted to take their own lives using rat poison they had somehow accessed. Both survived. The legal proceedings that followed separated them onto different tracks, with very different outcomes. Tyler, as a 14-year-old at the time of the act, was initially subject to juvenile proceedings, but prosecutors moved to have her tried as an adult, given the nature of what had happened. In 2011, Tyler entered a guilty plea to second-degree taking of life. Part of the agreement required her to testify against Culver at his trial. She did. She was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Culver's trial began in mid-2011 and drew significant press attention in Northern California. The proceedings featured elements that made the case particularly difficult to report in a straightforward way. Tyler testified on the stand about two supernatural figures she said lived inside her, whom she called Toby and Alex. One a dark presence and one a lighter one, each taking control of her behavior depending on her emotional state. A high-profile defense attorney who had been part of the O.J. Simpson defense team was brought in to challenge the DNA evidence prosecutors presented. None of it was enough. The jury took less than 24 hours to reach a verdict. Culver was found guilty of first-degree taking of life. He was sentenced to life in prison without any possibility of parole. On August 26, 2022, Tyler Witt was granted parole. She was released from custody in 2023, having served the better part of 12 years. She was 27 years old at the time of her release. Culver remains in prison. Joanne Witt's family members addressed the court during the sentencing hearing. Her brother Michael made a statement about Culver that conveyed the specific kind of anger that comes from watching someone show no remorse while sitting across a courtroom from you. Her father spoke. Joanne's parents, who had driven to the house and unlocked the front door for law enforcement on the day she was found, attended and sat through the entire process. Joanne had been trying to protect her daughter by removing a man from her home who had no legal right to be there in the relationship he was in. She had filed a formal complaint. She had done the things a parent is supposed to do. The complaint she filed, the official, legal, correct response to discovering what was happening, was the direct reason she was targeted on the night of June 11th. She was 47 years old. She was a single mother. She worked as an engineer. She had a daughter she had complicated history with and was trying, in the spring and early summer of 2009, to protect. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes everything we have seen so far, the financial pressure, the hidden life, the act carried out within the family home, and strips it back to something quieter and longer, and in many ways, harder to understand. It is the case of a son who did not act in a moment of crisis or in the grip of an obsession. He thought about it, planned it, and carried it out with a precision that told investigators everything they needed to know about who he was. Case 9. Barbara Daly Baekeland. The money behind the Baekeland name came from one of the most consequential inventions of the 20th century. Leo Baekeland was a Belgian-American chemist who, in 1907, created the world's first fully synthetic plastic material. He called it Bakelite. The material could be molded into almost any shape, did not conduct electricity, and did not melt under heat in the way earlier materials had. Within a decade of its introduction, it was everywhere. In electrical insulators, in telephones, in radios, in the handles of kitchen utensils, in the casings of early electrical equipment. Modern manufacturing, as it developed through the early and mid-20th century, was shaped, in a literal sense, by what Leo Baekeland had created. The fortune his invention produced passed to his descendants and sat at the center of the family's identity long after the man himself was gone. His grandson, Brooks Baekeland, was born into that inheritance. He presented himself as a writer, though, by the accounts of virtually everyone who knew him, he rarely actually wrote. He was handsome, adventurous, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from never having needed to worry seriously about money. In the mid-1940s, he met a young woman named Barbara Daly at a social event in California. Barbara Daly had not been born into that world. She came from a family of modest means in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her father had passed away by his own hand in January 1933, when Barbara was 11 years old. She and her mother had moved to New York City afterward, taking up residence in the Delmonico Hotel. Barbara had grown up in the gap between the life her circumstances offered and the life she believed she was made for, and she was extraordinarily good at closing that gap through the force of her own presentation. She was striking, recognized as one of the most beautiful women in certain New York social circles during the 1940s, modeling for publications including Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. She had taken a screen test in Hollywood. She moved through expensive rooms as if she had always belonged in them. She wanted Brooks Bakerland, and she secured him in a way that tells you something precise about who she was. She told him she was carrying his child. She was not. The marriage happened quickly on the basis of what turned out to be a false claim. The actual child, a son named Anthony, known to almost everyone who knew him as Tony, was born on August 28, 1946, a year or so after the wedding. Whatever the marriage had been built on, a real family now existed within it. From the outside, the Bakerlands looked like a particular kind of glamorous American success. Wealth, beauty, a child, residences in New York and across Europe, dinner parties attended by significant cultural figures of the era. They moved constantly, maintaining a nomadic existence across multiple countries with the ease that sufficient money makes possible. Their circle included writers, artists, and socialites. Brooks was charming in a distracted way. Barbara was vivid and talked about excessively. Tony grew up in this world, educated partially in Europe, absorbing the texture of a lifestyle that had no stable centre. What was happening beneath the surface of the Bakerland household was considerably more complicated. Brooks and Barbara's marriage deteriorated steadily. Both were involved in other relationships during their marriage. Barbara struggled with her mental health in ways that became more visible over time. She was known among friends and acquaintances for unpredictable outbursts, for shifts in behaviour that could turn a social occasion hostile without warning, for bouts of depression that were serious enough to have led to multiple attempts on her own life. She drank heavily. She and Brooks fought. The house, wherever it happened to be located that season, was not a stable or predictable environment for a growing child. Tony showed signs of genuine artistic ability and intelligence when he was young. His parents presented him proudly, describing him as a prodigy. But as he entered his teens and then his early adult years, other things became visible. He had begun using substances introduced to hallucinogenic drugs by an acquaintance he met in Italy when he was around 20. His behaviour became more erratic. He showed increasing signs of paranoia and disordered thinking. He was eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia. His father's response to this diagnosis was to refuse to allow psychiatric treatment. Brooks Bakerland described the entire field of psychiatry as professionally worthless in his view, and declined to authorise or fund the kind of ongoing professional care that a young man with Tony's condition needed. Tony went largely untreated for his illness during years when treatment might have made a meaningful difference. There was also the question of Tony's personal life. He had relationships with men. In the world Barbara Bakerland occupied, the particular social universe of mid-century European and American wealth she had worked so hard to enter and remain in, this was something she found deeply unacceptable, not on principled grounds, but on social and self-regarding ones. She could not accommodate what it meant for the image she had built. She tried to address it directly and disastrously. She brought a young Spanish woman named Sylvie into the household with the explicit intention that Tony and Sylvie would develop a relationship that would resolve what Barbara saw as a problem. The plan failed completely. What actually happened was that Sylvie and Brooks began a relationship with each other. Brooks divorced Barbara in 1968 and eventually married Sylvie, leaving Barbara with Tony, with the apartment income she retained from the settlement and with the wreckage of the social identity she had spent decades constructing. Still determined to alter Tony in the direction she wanted, Barbara brought paid companions to the apartment and pushed Tony into interactions he had not chosen. When this also produced no result, she went further. What she is alleged to have done next has never been conclusively proven in a legal sense, but it is described consistently across the accounts of friends, investigators, and the book and film the case later inspired. Barbara Bakerland is alleged to have had a sexual relationship with her own son, framed by her as a means of redirecting his orientation. Whether the people who knew her believed she was capable of this varies in the record. What the record also shows is that multiple people who knew the family observed in Tony during this period a deterioration that went beyond what his schizophrenia alone would explain. A person being systematically dismantled by the environment surrounding him. By 1972, Tony and Barbara were living together in a penthouse apartment on Cadogan Square in Chelsea, London. The apartment was elegant and expensive in the way everything connected to the Baekeland name tended to be. Barbara was still socially active, still attending dinners, still describing to friends a life she characterized as full and satisfying. Tony was 25, living with his mother, untreated or inadequately treated for a serious psychiatric condition, and by the accounts of people who encountered him during this period, in a state that alarmed anyone who looked closely. In late July 1972, the situation inside the Cadogan Square apartment produced something that should have ended things before they reached the point they eventually reached. Tony attempted to push his mother into the path of traffic on the street outside the building. A friend of Barbara's who was present intervened and prevented it. Barbara refused to file any kind of complaint or charge in connection with the incident. Tony was taken to the Priory, a private psychiatric facility, for a period. He was released. He continued seeing a psychiatrist on an outpatient basis. That psychiatrist became alarmed enough by what he observed in his sessions with Tony to take an unusual step. On October 30th, 1972, 18 days before what eventually happened, the doctor contacted Barbara directly and told her in the clearest possible terms that Tony was capable of taking her life, that she was at serious risk, that she should not dismiss what he was telling her as a clinical abstraction. Barbara's response, as the doctor later recalled it, was to tell him she did not believe she was at risk. She was 51 years old. On the afternoon of November 17, 1972, Barbara Baekeland had returned to the Cadogan Square apartment after an outing. The specific sequence of events inside the apartment that afternoon is known only through what Tony later described. A phone call that disturbed him, a dispute with his mother when she returned, a deterioration in his mental state during the hours that followed. A friend of Barbara's had been invited to come by for drinks that evening. Tony used a kitchen knife. The attack was swift. Barbara was struck in a way that caused her to pass away almost immediately. She was in the kitchen of the apartment she had furnished and occupied for years, in the middle of an ordinary London autumn afternoon, 18 days after a doctor had sat across from her and told her the exact thing that was going to happen. When police arrived at the Cadogan Square apartment, they found Tony in the room. He was on the phone placing an order for Chinese food to be delivered. The response of the people who had known Barbara Baekeland when they learned what had happened was, in many cases, the response of people who had been watching something move toward a conclusion they had not known how to stop. Friends later described the relationship between Barbara and Tony to journalists and researchers as one of the most mutually destructive they had ever observed, a bond characterized by ferocious closeness and equally ferocious cruelty, with neither person able to separate from the other and neither able to survive the attachment intact. Tony was charged with his mother's loss of life. The legal process in England determined that because of his schizophrenia diagnosis and the state of his mental health at the time, he was not criminally responsible in the conventional sense. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to Broadmoor Hospital, England's highest security psychiatric institution, where he remained for 8 years. His release came in July 1980, secured partly through the efforts of a group of friends and family members, including his paternal grandmother Nina Daly, who was 87 years old and who agreed to take responsibility for Tony and provide a home for him in New York City. His father Brooks opposed the release entirely, describing his son in the starkest possible terms in correspondence from this period. Tony flew to New York from England and moved into Nina Daly's apartment. He had been out of Broadmoor for 6 days when, on July 27, 1980, he attacked his grandmother with a kitchen knife. She was stabbed 8 times. She was 87 years old. She survived. Tony was arrested by New York City police, charged with the attack on his grandmother, and sent to Rikers Island for assessment and incarceration. The psychiatric team at Rikers evaluated him over the following months. A court hearing was scheduled for March 20, 1981, at which the question of bail was expected to be addressed. On March 20th, the hearing was adjourned. The reason was procedural. a delay in the transfer of Tony's medical records from Broadmoor in the United Kingdom. The court could not proceed without the documents. The hearing was postponed. Tony was taken back to his cell at Rikers Island at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon. 30 minutes later, he was found. He had taken his own life by suffocation. He was 34 years old. The means he used carried a particular and terrible irony. Plastic, the material whose invention had created the Bakerland fortune and the world he had been born into, was what he had used in his final moments in a cell in a New York prison. The 2007 film Savage Grace, directed by Tom Kalin, dramatised the story of Barbara and Tony Bakerland, from Tony's birth through to Barbara's passing. Julianne Moore played Barbara. Eddie Redmayne played Tony. The film was adapted from a book of the same name by Natalie Robbins and Stephen Aronson, published in 1985, which drew on letters, diaries, and interviews with people who had known the family across 4 decades. Barbara Daly Bakerland had built her entire adult life around access to a world she had not been born into. She had used everything she had, her appearance, her social intelligence, her willingness to deceive, to get there and stay there. The cost of staying was a marriage built on a lie, a son born into profound instability, a divorce that stripped away the husband whose name had provided the access she had wanted, and then years alone in expensive apartments with a son whose illness was never properly treated and whose relationship with her had never, by any account, been simple or safe. Her psychiatrist had told her 18 days before it happened. She had said she did not believe it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case in this video involves a woman whose passing was not at the hands of a child she had raised through decades of shared history, or a son in the grip of an untreated psychiatric condition. It was at the hands of the person who should have been the safest person in her world. And it happened, according to investigators, because he had decided that her discovery of who he actually was left him no other option. Case 10. Susan Cabot. Before the home in Encino became a place people drove past and wondered about, before the court documents and the ninja story and the 3 years of probation, before any of it, Susan Cabot was a girl named Harriet Pearl Shapiro, and she had been dealt a start to her life that most people who later watched her on cinema screens never knew anything about. She was born in Boston on July 9, 1927. Her father left the family when she was still young. Her mother Elizabeth had severe mental health problems that worsened over time and eventually required institutionalization. With both parents effectively gone, Harriet was placed into foster care. She spent her childhood in 8 different foster homes, mostly in the Bronx in New York City. Her psychiatrist, who would later treat her for 7 years during the last stretch of her life, stated in court proceedings that she had suffered emotional and physical mistreatment in the care system during those years, which produced effects that stayed with her permanently. She remade herself from that beginning. By her early 20s, she had changed her name to Susan Cabot and was working as a model and finding her way into acting. The early 1950s were good years professionally. She signed with Universal Pictures and appeared in a run of westerns, often opposite leading men who would go on to become household names. She appeared in Tomahawk in 1951, The Duel at Silver Creek in 1952, and Gunsmoke in 1953. She had a quality on screen that was specific and not easily described, a kind of self-possession that read as confidence without being cold. The work was not high art, but it was steady, and she was competent in it, and occasionally more than competent. She eventually severed her contract with Universal and moved toward lower-budget productions. In the later years of the decade, she became a regular presence in the films of director Roger Corman, who was then building the machinery of what would become an entire genre of fast, cheap, imaginative cinema. She appeared in Sorority Girl in 1957, then War of the Satellites, and Machine Gun Kelly, both in 1958, the second of these alongside a young Charles Bronson in one of his early prominent roles. Her final film was The Wasp Woman in 1959, a Corman horror picture in which she played a cosmetics executive who experiments with a wasp-based rejuvenation formula with catastrophic results. It is the film she is most remembered for, partly because of how completely it vanished from circulation for years, and partly because of the specific strangeness of what it asked its lead actress to do. After 1959, her screen career effectively ended. She made a television appearance in 1970 and did some off-Broadway theatre in the early 1960s, but the sustained professional life that had defined her 30s stopped being available to her. She withdrew. She remained in Los Angeles, in a house on a hill in the Encino neighborhood of the San Fernando Valley, and the world of premieres and contract negotiations and promotional photographs receded until it might as well have happened to someone else. The story of how her son came to exist is one of the stranger threads in an already unusual life. In the early 1960s, a CIA dinner party in Los Angeles brought Susan Cabot into contact with King Hussein of Jordan. She was in her mid-30s at the time. Hussein was in his mid-20s. Documents declassified as part of the release of files connected to the Kennedy assassination confirmed the nature of what the CIA had arranged. Hussein was visiting Los Angeles, and the agency had made arrangements to provide female companionship during his stay. Cabot later told a journalist that she had been approached by her CIA contact and asked directly to sleep with the king. She said she refused the explicit framing of that request, but attended the gathering and found herself genuinely drawn to him. The relationship that developed between them lasted several years, conducted across multiple visits and locations. In 1964, Susan Cabot had a son. She named him Timothy Scott. He was born prematurely, under difficult circumstances that left him with complications from the start. The birth required emergency intervention. The infant required surgery in his first weeks of life for a twisted intestine. He had seizures. He was eventually diagnosed with dwarfism, a condition affecting his pituitary gland and his growth. The identity of Timothy's father has never been formally confirmed through any official process. What the legal proceedings that came later established was that during the trial, his defense team presented court documents showing Cabot had received $1,500 a month from the keeper of the King's Purse in Jordan, the household financial office of the Jordanian royal family. The defense characterized this arrangement in the explicit terms of what it most resembled. King Hussein never publicly acknowledged any connection to Timothy Roman. Hussein passed away in 1999. His official biography makes no mention of Susan Cabot or of their reported relationship. Timothy's father of record was Michael Roman, a businessman and former actor who became Susan's second husband. Susan and Michael raised Timothy together until the marriage ended in divorce in 1983. By that point, Timothy was 19 and had spent his entire childhood in the Encino house with a mother who adored him in the consuming, total way of someone for whom he represented her only meaningful connection to the world. The growth hormone injections are the part of Timothy's early life that the defense later made most use of. Susan had arranged for him to receive an experimental hormone treatment intended to address the dwarfism and stimulate physical growth. By the time he was in his mid-20s, he had reached 5 feet 4 inches, a height that the treatment had contributed to, though not without cost. The particular hormone preparation used was later linked to Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, a devastating and fatal neurological condition caused by malformed proteins called prions. CJD destroys brain tissue systematically and produces, in the period before it becomes clinically obvious, neurological and behavioral changes that can appear as severe mood instability, confusion, and loss of rational capacity. Whether Timothy Roman was affected by prion contamination from the treatment he received was never definitively established in the legal proceedings, but it was the central argument his defense built everything around. What the later years of Susan Cabot's life looked like from the outside was a slow contraction of everything she had once been. She had retired from acting. She maintained an adequate income from real estate investments she had made over the years, and from a habit she had developed of buying vintage cars, restoring them, and reselling them. An unlikely pursuit for a former Hollywood actress, but one she was apparently genuinely skilled at. She had enough money. What she did not have, as the 1980s progressed, was stability. Her mental health deteriorated in ways that were visible to the people around her. Her psychologist, a man named Carl Faber, who had been treating her for 7 years by the end of her life, later testified at the trial that she was among the most troubled patients he had encountered in his professional practice. The sessions, he said, had become emotionally exhausting in ways that went beyond the normal demands of clinical work. The interior of the house on the hill in Encino had fallen into a state that reflected what was happening inside Susan Cabot. Old newspapers accumulated, food spoiled. The maintenance that a house requires when someone is functioning at capacity simply did not happen. A neighbour who spoke to journalists described the relationship between mother and son as extraordinarily close. Cabot never went anywhere without Timothy, and Timothy was deeply dependent on her in the mutual way of two people who have only each other. Susan told Carl Faber, sometime in the months before December 1986, that Timothy was the only reason she was still alive. That if it were not for him, she would not be. On the night of December 10th, 1986, something happened inside the Encino house that ended with Susan Cabot at 59 years old in a blood-soaked nightgown in the master suite of her own home. What exactly happened has never been resolved to a point of complete certainty, because the only person present who survived is the person who also had a legal interest in how the events were described. What Timothy told police initially was a story that investigators found implausible almost immediately. He said he had been asleep or semi-conscious when a tall man with long curly hair, wearing the clothing of a ninja, had broken into the house, attacked his mother, struck him hard enough to knock him unconscious, and stolen $70,000 in cash before leaving. Officers who arrived at the scene found this account difficult to reconcile with the physical evidence before them. Susan Cabot had been beaten severely enough to produce blood across the walls and ceiling of the room. Timothy, despite claiming to have been knocked out by the same attacker, had only superficial injuries. A paramedic who testified at the subsequent trial said the head injury Timothy showed was not consistent with the kind of blow that would have rendered a person unconscious. Police also found the weightlifting bar, the object that had been used on Susan Cabot, hidden in Timothy's clothes hamper. In the days that followed, Timothy's account changed. His defense team eventually acknowledged the first story had not been true. The version that emerged in its place, and which became the basis of the defense at trial, was substantially different. Timothy testified that his mother had woken up that night in a state of acute mental crisis, disoriented, terrified, not recognizing who he was, calling out for her own mother Elizabeth, who had been institutionalized decades earlier and who was, by this point, long gone from the world. In her panicked state, according to his testimony, she had picked up the weightlifting bar and come at him with it, and had also produced a scalpel. He said he had grabbed the bar from her to protect himself, and that what happened next was something he could not fully account for in terms of his own actions. That the last thing he remembered clearly was trying to push her away and get out of the room. He admitted hiding the bar. He said he did not believe anyone would credit the real account over the invented one, and he had panicked. The prosecution, charged originally with second-degree criminal responsibility, found itself in the position of arguing a case in which the physical evidence, while clearly establishing that Timothy had been responsible for Susan's passing, did not cleanly establish premeditation. The defense's argument was built around two pillars that operated simultaneously. First, that Susan had attacked her son in the grip of a psychotic episode, and second, that Timothy's own mental capacity had been compromised by the experimental hormone treatment he had received throughout his childhood, producing in him a susceptibility to explosive behavioral responses that a person without that pharmaceutical history would not have had. Carl Faber's testimony was significant for the prosecution's framing of Susan's mental state. He described her condition in the final weeks of her life as seriously deteriorated, more than he had seen in 7 years of treating her. But he also described her stated love for Timothy as the thing holding her in the world. The picture the testimony produced was of a woman in profound psychological distress, who was simultaneously the only stable relationship in her son's life, and a person who, on the wrong night, in the wrong state of mind, could not recognize the person she loved most. The first trial, which began in May 1989, ended before a verdict. One of Timothy's defense attorneys had to be hospitalized for serious cardiac problems brought on by the stress of the proceedings. A mistrial was declared. The second trial was conducted without a jury, a bench trial before Van Nuys Superior Court Judge Darlene E. Schempp. The defense presented its case around the hormone contamination argument and the account of Susan's mental state that night. The prosecution, in its closing argument, stepped back from the second-degree charge and asked for a conviction on voluntary manslaughter instead. Judge Schempp went further. She convicted Timothy Roman of involuntary manslaughter, a finding that the prosecution's own evidence had not required her to reach, but which she determined was the most accurate legal characterization of what the trial had established. She deliberated for 10 minutes. On November 28, 1989, Timothy Roman was sentenced. He had already spent 2.5 years in custody. Judge Schempp sentenced him to 3 years of probation and ordered him to attend psychiatric counselling. He walked out of the courtroom. The reaction from those who had known Susan Cabot, or who had followed the case, was divided in the way that cases involving genuinely ambiguous circumstances tend to produce divided reactions. There were people who looked at the outcome: a mother found beaten to death in her own home, a son who initially lied to police and hid the weapon, and found the resolution incomprehensible. There were others who looked at the totality of what the trial had revealed about Susan's final years, and who found it at least possible that what had happened on December 10, 1986, had been something other than a deliberate act carried out by a son against a mother he had decided to harm. What is not ambiguous is the shape of Susan Cabot's life and the forces that shaped it. She had built herself from nothing, from 8 foster homes and 2 absent parents, and whatever she carried out of those years that she never fully put down. She had made a career, made herself known in a particular world, found her way into a relationship with a foreign king whose name she never traded on publicly, and raised a son who was the only thing she said kept her connected to the desire to stay alive. The house on the hill in Encino, with its old newspapers and its vintage cars and its 2 inhabitants who had nobody else, was what remained of all of that by the time the 1980s were drawing toward their close. Timothy Roman passed away in 2003. His ashes were scattered at sea. He left no public account of his life after the trial, or of what he made of what had happened on the night of December 10, 1986. The Encino house, the weightlifting bar, the ninja story that collapsed almost immediately, all of it belongs to a case that ended not with a prison sentence, but with a man walking out of a courtroom into an ordinary Los Angeles afternoon, while his mother remained, as she had been since 1986, entirely and permanently absent from it. What runs through all 10 cases in this video, the planning, the obsession, the financial pressure, the twisted love, the decades of dysfunction arriving at a single moment, is the same essential fact. The person who passed away in each one trusted, or at least could not have fully defended against, the person who ended their life. That proximity, that closeness, that assumption of safety within the walls of family, it is exactly what makes these cases impossible to simply process and move past. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.